Who are you, really? Not the name they gave you, not the job title printed on your badge, nor the pictures you post on social media. All of that is just a mask, a carefully rehearsed persona, but not your essence. And yet, we spend our lives believing that the self is exactly this, a bundle of labels, memories, and social roles. But what if I told you that this solid sense of identity is nothing but an illusion, that what you call yourself is only a narrative, a hall of mirrors where the ego hides behind layers of thoughts and the need for external validation? Notice how tightly we cling to definitions. I am this, I am that. And when someone questions us, it feels as if our very existence is under threat. Isn't that strange? Could the truth of consciousness really be so fragile that it collapses under a single question? Socrates once said, "Know thyself." It sounds simple, yet this invitation conceals an abyss, because in searching for what is authentic, you may discover that the I you've always defended never truly existed. And that's where the fear of nothingness is born, but also the promise of a new inner freedom, one that does not depend on roles, masks, or approval. What you're about to discover might shake the ground you walk on, and at the same time, open the door to a life of authenticity, clarity, and peace. Now imagine a river. At first glance, it seems always the same, flowing before us as if eternal. But look again. At every moment, the water is no longer the same. The current has already changed. Our identity is just like this. We think it's something fixed, solid, but in truth, it is movement, change, passage. Still, we insist on believing there is an immutable I, as if it were a rock standing in the middle of the stream. In everyday life, this belief shows up when we say, "That's just who I am. I'll never change." Look at social media. Carefully curated profiles full of photos, quotes, achievements. Everything seems to shout, "This is me." But is it really? Or is it only a story we create so we don't have to face the emptiness of silence within us? Socrates also affirmed, "The unexamined life is not worth living." When we fail to examine who we are, we become trapped in the illusion of permanence. That ignorance makes us suffer. We fight to defend a story. We're wounded when someone questions our consistency, and we lose ourselves in the endless chase for external validation. The cost is high: anxiety, comparison, suffering, and the constant fear of never being enough. But there is a way out: self-knowledge, not as something purely intellectual, but as real presence, as ongoing observation. When we become witnesses of our own thoughts, we see that they come and go without asking permission. And if thoughts are not permanent, how could they ever define who we are? This is where the philosophical solution arises. Let go of the obsession with a fixed identity and recognize that we are like the river, not a thing, but a process, not an object, but a flow. The game of life is not about holding on to the waters, but about learning to move with them. And you? Have you ever realized that the self you defend so fiercely might be nothing more than a narrative? Think of Greek theater. Actors would enter the stage wearing large masks called persona. They didn't just project the voice, they defined the role. Curiously, we still carry this today. Each of us wears a mask, a persona, often without noticing. And what's even more intriguing is that over time, we confuse the mask with the very self. In everyday life, this is obvious. At work, we are competent professionals. At home, responsible parents or children. On social media, perfect lives. Every environment asks for a role, and we obey. But this obedience comes at a cost. We lose touch with authenticity. We become actors who have forgotten they are acting. How many times have you felt exhausted from sustaining an image that didn't match what you truly felt inside? Plato once said, "The greatest victory is to conquer oneself." Yet how can we conquer ourselves if we are always busy chasing the applause of others? The ego feeds on this game, collecting praise, likes, and comparisons. The result is a cycle of resentment and judgment. We're caught between the fear of disappointing and the desire to be accepted. This generates suffering, creates emotional scars, and prolongs the cycle of pain. The solution is not to deny the roles, but to remember they are just that, roles. True strength emerges when we play the game of life lightly, when we wear the mask without forgetting who is behind it. It's the practice of detachment which restores our inner freedom. And here comes the practice of self-forgiveness and self-acceptance. To recognize that we have misplayed roles, that we have made mistakes, but that learning is always possible. Instead of carrying guilt, we choose compassion and empathy toward ourselves. Only then do we regain the energy to live with more balance and presence. In the end, it's not about abolishing masks, but about laughing at them, using them consciously, knowing that true awareness is always behind them. As both spectators and actors, we begin to live with more fluidity and less weight. And you? Have you ever found yourself wearing a mask for so long that you forgot who was behind it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now, imagine the sea. On the surface, we see distinct waves, each with its shape, height, and speed. Some seem bigger, others insignificant. But look closely. No wave exists apart from the ocean. All are expressions of the same body of water. In the same way, we believe we are isolated individuals, but in essence, we are only movements of the same unity. In everyday life, the illusion of separation is constantly reinforced. We compete on social media, measure our worth through comparison, try to prove that we are unique through possessions or achievements. This mindset creates suffering, generates anxiety, and makes us forget that true strength does not come from being more than others, but from recognizing the bond that sustains us. How many of us have felt the deepest loneliness in the middle of a digitally connected crowd? Aristotle said that man is by nature a social being, yet the ego convinces us that we must protect ourselves, build walls, and fight for recognition. Ignorance of this truth traps us in cycles of distrust, comparison, and resentment. The result is the loss of empathy, compassion, and the sense of belonging. But there is a way out, to realize that the self is not an isolated fragment, but an expression of the whole. When we understand that we are like the wave, inseparable from the ocean, a deep sense of self-knowledge and presence arises within us. This awareness dissolves loneliness and creates space for clarity, peace, and true inner freedom. Ancient philosophy and even modern science confirm this. Neuroscience research shows that the human brain is shaped by relationships, and studies in positive psychology reinforce that cooperation generates more happiness than competition. In other words, even biologically, we were made for unity. In the end, recognizing that there is no separate self is liberating. It's ceasing to see yourself as a fragile piece of the universe and beginning to recognize yourself as the universe itself, looking back at itself. It's the realization that we are not just in the game of life, we are the very game unfolding. And you? Have you ever felt part of something much greater than yourself? Now, imagine a movie theater. On the screen, the images change constantly. Drama, comedy, action. The audience laughs, cries, gets startled, but there is something that never changes: the screen. It remains untouched, indifferent to whatever is projected. That's how our consciousness is. Thoughts are like films. They arise, shine, and fade away. But what you truly are, the silent witness, remains unshaken. In everyday life, we confuse the screen with the movie. We think, I am anxious, I am insecure, I am happy. But in reality, we are not the thoughts that come and go. We are that which perceives them. Yet most people live as hostages to this mental narrative, unable to experience inner silence. That's why so many can't stay alone without grabbing their phones. The mind demands noise because it fears stillness. Socrates once asked, what if everything we believe we know is nothing but shadows? When we fail to distinguish between consciousness and thought, we remain trapped in shadows. The consequence is clear. Our identity shrinks into memories, opinions, and judgments. We carry old resentments, repeat mistakes, perpetuate cycles of pain, and lose ourselves in stories that distance us from inner freedom. But there is a path to cultivate attentive observation. Philosophy calls it reflection. Modern psychology calls it metacognition. Both point to the same truth: to learn to look at thoughts without identifying with them. When this happens, something extraordinary occurs. We feel inner space, clarity, a new energy that liberates. Within that space, self-forgiveness, compassion, and self-acceptance are born, because we come to understand that we are not our mistakes, but the consciousness that recognizes and learns from them. Thought becomes a tool, not a tyrant, and life, once heavy, gains fluidity. We then arrive at the limit of reason and the beginning of mystery. If we are not our thoughts, what are we? Here begins the true philosophical dive, the point where the mind fears facing nothingness, and at the same time senses the possibility of a new reality. And you? Have you ever experienced that instant when for a moment you realize you are more than what your mind tells you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Close your eyes and imagine standing before an abyss. There is no ground, no walls, nothing to hold on to. This is the moment when the ego realizes that its supposed solidity is nothing but an invention. It is the shock of nothingness, not a dead void, but the absence of any fixed definition of I. In today's world, we flee from this encounter at all costs. We distract ourselves with social media, endless series, superficial conversations, all of it just to avoid hearing the uncomfortable sound of inner silence. As Epictetus said, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but the opinions we have about them. And the greatest illusory opinion we carry is that we are a fixed, unshakable someone. Ignorance of this truth brings devastating consequences. We run in circles, trapped in the cycle of pain, seeking meaning in external achievements, collecting frustrations and resentments. We build a fortress of masks, but inside we feel the weight of separation and the lack of authenticity. And the most ironic part? All of this just to avoid an encounter with the freedom that was always within reach. Socrates reminds us, the unexamined life is not worth living. And here lies the unsettling truth. When you examine yourself deeply, you discover that there is no solid self to be found. That discovery is frightening, it's terrifying, but it is also liberating, because if there is nothing fixed to defend, you can finally rest. This nothingness is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is clarity, peace, inner freedom. It is the possibility of living with fluidity, without the prison of external validation, without the burden of constant judgment. It is the space where true transformation is born, where the soul finds balance, and life becomes a dance again, not a prison. So I ask you, with the force of Socratic questioning, what if everything you believe about yourself is just an illusion? What if the I you defend never truly existed? What if what you fear losing is exactly what keeps you from living? Reflect seriously. The answer to these questions may radically change the way you exist. And you? Have you ever faced that inner abyss where everything seems to dissolve and paradoxically felt a strange sense of freedom begin to emerge? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this reflection is making sense to you, like this video and subscribe to continue this philosophical dialogue. Imagine a mirror. It does not create images. It only reflects what stands before it. But what if the mirror were so perfect that it forgot itself, believing it was nothing more than the shapes it reflected? This is the human condition. We confuse the fleeting image with the essence. And here enters the ancient teaching of Vedanta. Tat tvam asi. You are that. Not a reflection, not a mask, but the very source of reality. In daily life, we forget this principle. We seek identity in titles, possessions, and comparisons. But in doing so, we become trapped by the ego, by the game of appearances. Just look at how many people's self-esteem depends on likes or external validation. we are carried away by the urge to prove our worth, when in truth, our worth already lies in simply being. Plato once said, "The body is the prison of the soul." When we believe we are only a social role or a collection of thoughts, we live imprisoned. The consequence is clear. We lose touch with presence, fall into anxiety, and reinforce the emotional scars born of judgment and resentment. But the path of Socrates and the ancient sages was different: to question. Questioning is the key that opens the door to consciousness. When we ask ourselves deeply, "Who am I?" we dismantle the ego's narrative and touch the unspeakable. In that space, we perceive we are not a part of life. We are life itself, observing itself. This realization changes everything. Suddenly a vibrant clarity arises, a peace that does not depend on circumstances. There is no longer a need to prove anything to anyone because there is no someone left to defend. What remains is authenticity, the simplicity of being, the flow of existence in its unity. Tattvam asi is more than a spiritual phrase. It is a reminder. You don't need to become something. You already are. You don't need to conquer yourself. You simply need to remember. It is the point where philosophy, spirituality, and even behavioral science converge. The notion that the human being is not separate from the whole, but an expression of it. And you? Have you ever felt, even for an instant, that you were inseparable from everything around you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now imagine a child playing in the sand by the sea. She builds castles, creates stories, invents worlds. But when the tide rises and sweeps it all away, she neither cries nor despairs. Deep down, she knows it was always just a game. That is how our lives should be. Roles, titles, and achievements seen as part of the great game of life, and not as prisons. In daily life, however, we forget this. We wear the mask of absolute seriousness. We struggle to uphold the character of the successful professional, the perfect friend, the exemplary family member. The problem is that we identify so completely with these roles that when one of them falls apart, it feels like the death of the self. How many times have we seen someone collapse after losing a job or social status? Not because they lost the role itself, but because they believed they were only that role. Seneca warned us, "It is not that we have little time, but that we waste much of it." And one of the greatest wastes is spending our lives trying to maintain a fixed image. The ego believes that freedom lies in controlling everything, in consolidating a strong persona. But wisdom shows the opposite. Freedom arises when we learn to laugh at the roles, to wear them lightly and with detachment. This detachment does not mean indifference. It means intimacy with reality itself. It is the ability to live with fluidity, to adapt like water that takes the shape of its container without losing its essence. When we are not trapped by judgment and the need for external validation, we experience a new energy: confidence, surrender, authenticity. Self-knowledge deepens at this point as we come to understand that we can make mistakes, change, improvise. Out of this comes self-forgiveness, compassion, and even the courage to simply be. Here is where true inner freedom is born. The freedom to live without fear of disappointing others, without obsession over controlling how we are seen. And then life becomes like that child on the beach once again, not a battle for survival, but a dance. And when we dance, it no longer matters how others see us, but whether we are in tune with the invisible music that moves everything. And you? Have you ever lived a moment when you felt that everything was just a game, and precisely because of that, everything became lighter? Now think of a flame. As it burns, it emits light and heat, but it cannot be captured. If you try to hold it, it slips away, burns, or extinguishes. Such is the question, who am I? We spend our lives trying to contain it with fixed answers: name, profession, stories, memories. But deep down, this question was never meant to be answered. It was meant to set us free. In daily life, we insist on seeking definitions. We want someone to say, "You are this, you are that." This search for external validation locks us into invisible prisons. We work without pause, post without rest, compete without end, all to sustain a convincing answer. But here is the paradox. The more we try to define the self, the further we move from what we really are, pure presence and consciousness. Socrates, in his disarming simplicity, said, "All I know is that I know nothing. That is the true key." When we embrace mystery, the mind stops chasing certainties, and in the space that opens, we discover what was always there: silence, peace, authenticity. The consequence is liberating. We stop carrying the burden of a fixed identity and learn to live as part of the flow, in harmony with the unity that runs through us. This detachment does not make us less human. On the contrary, it makes us more compassionate, more empathetic, more capable of seeing others without judgment. Because when we no longer defend a mask, there is room to recognize another's pain and to practice compassion and self-forgiveness. The result is a new cycle, no longer of pain, but of liberation and transformation. It is at this point that we realize the game of life is not about solving the riddle of who we are, but about playing lightly, learning from each mistake, honoring each moment of suffering as part of the learning. We don't need a final conclusion, but rather the courage to live the question. And so the question, "Who am I?" ceases to be a suffocating riddle and becomes an open door. Not toward an answer, but toward full experience, toward the moment, toward the dance, toward the clarity that the self was never something to be found, but always that which witnesses, which observes, which lives. Throughout this reflection, we have seen that what we call identity may be nothing more than a construction, a set of masks, memories, and social roles that we confuse with the true self. But when we dare to question, when we face silence and become witnesses of our own thoughts, we discover that behind the illusion lies something greater, a living presence, free and indestructible. The fear of nothingness transforms into clarity, separation into unity, the rigid mask into fluidity. In this space, inner freedom emerges, not as an external achievement, but as a remembrance of what we have always been. As Socrates said, "Know thyself." This is not an invitation to find more answers, but to live with courage before the mystery. Therefore, it is not about denying roles or responsibilities, but about remembering that life is a game, and that by playing it with lightness, authenticity, and detachment, we find not only peace but also compassion, empathy, and a new way of loving the world. If this reflection touched you, share in the comments. Life is presence. And subscribe to continue this philosophical dialogue, because the next step may reveal something even deeper. And remember, perhaps the question, "Who am I?" never needed an answer, because true wisdom lies in living the question. The next step may reveal something even deeper,